Please welcome to the stage Judge Steven Leifman and Major Jimmie Barrett.
Good morning. Everybody get their coffee and take a rest break here. We're going to jump right into this with Judge Leifman. He's been doing some innovative things down in Miami-Dade County on mental health and within the criminal justice system. And I want to key it off with two thoughts. One is, what did you find when you first came into your position? And two, when you saw that, what did you say needed to change or work on? And then at the end there, kind of give us what are some of the outcomes that you've had recently?
Sure, thank you. And thank you very much for holding this conference. It's incredibly important and probably finally we're in the right track. I think what you find is when you're a judge for several years that in many ways the criminal justice system is the repository for many failed public policies. And there is no greater failed public policy than our treatment towards people with serious mental illnesses. In fact, while the United States has 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's inmates. So as we sit here this morning, 1 out of 104 adults in the United States are behind bars. 1 out of 33 adults in the United States are under correctional supervision. And since 1980, the number of people going to jail has tripled, and their sentences have increased by about 166%. And so if you peel back that onion to figure out what in the heck has happened, what you will find is much of this is due to untreated mental illnesses and substance use disorders. In fact, people with mental illnesses are 10 times more likely to find a bed in jail than at any state hospital. They're 19 times more likely to find a bed in the criminal justice system than any state civil hospital. 40% of all people with serious mental illnesses at some point end up in the criminal justice system. And last year alone, there were about 2 million people with serious mental illnesses arrested in this country. And on any given day, we have about 400,000 people with serious mental illnesses in jails and prisons, and another 800,000 under some type of correctional supervision. And so it's incredibly tragic because it's incredibly unnecessary. You know, most people don't know, but recovery rates for people with serious mental illnesses are actually better than for people with heart disease and diabetes. These are not life sentences. In fact, they're no more dangerous than the general population, and sadly, they're much more likely to be victims of violent crimes than most people in our society. And so how do we deal with this and how do we fix it? So in 2000, I had a very difficult case. It turned out that the defendant in my courtroom was a Harvard-educated psychiatrist who had a late onset of schizophrenia. And he had a full-blown psychotic episode in my courtroom. And it really opened up a window to me to understand what a terrible, difficult problem we had. It wasn't just a local problem, but it was a state and national one as well. And I think one of the best things about being a judge is when you call a meeting, people come. They don't want to be there. And so we decided that we needed a summit and that we needed all the traditional and non-traditional stakeholders in our community to come together and to map out how our criminal justice system intersected with our community mental health system. And so we called this meeting. We brought in 3 national experts to help facilitate it, which was very helpful. And what we found very quickly is that our system was embarrassingly dysfunctional. And it was pretty offensive because what we realized is that we had designed a system designed to fail. And then we punish people when we don't offer them the services that they need where we know they can recover by putting them back in jail and watching them recycle. And so as a result of this summit, we created this 2-part system. And if I were to do it again, I would have a 3-part system. And the 2-part was how do we reduce the flow into our system so we could actually reduce the number of people with mental illnesses coming into the system? And then what do we do once they do penetrate the system? How do we identify people with these illnesses, and how do we then divert them into treatment that might be effective? And so we looked around the country, and the best pre-arrest diversion program came out of Memphis, Tennessee. It's called Crisis Intervention Team Policing. It's a 40-hour training program that teaches law enforcement how to identify people in crisis, which you're very familiar with, how to de-escalate, and then where to take people as opposed to arresting them. It has been remarkably successful. We have 36 police departments in Miami-Dade. We now have the largest trained squad of law enforcement officers in the United States. We have over 7,300 officers trained in crisis intervention team policing. And we keep data on every single CIT call that our two largest agencies make. And over the last 8 years, from 2010 through 2018, our two largest agencies handled 91,472,000 mental health calls. But what was most impressive about that, however, is that of the 91,472,000 calls, they only made 152 arrests. So the arrests in Dade County went from 118,000 a year when we started this project to 53,000 today. And it enabled us to actually close one of our three main jails. And usually, and I heard one of the comments earlier, a lot of this is about cost shifting. But if you can actually close a jail, then it actually becomes about cost savings. And so for us, it was a savings of $12 million a year. And it's been closed 7, 8 years at this point, and it's had a significant impact. We also learned some really interesting statistics as a result of it, and one of it was something that we had not anticipated, and that was the level of PTSD among our law enforcement officers. And so the woman that trains our officers actually gets 150 calls a month from police officers for their own personal mental health issues. And there's a lot of reasons for it, and it's very understandable if you understand the science of trauma. Trauma, PTS, is physiological. It's not an emotional response. It has to do with your pituitary gland, and it sends a message to the adrenaline, it releases cortisol, and it's your flight or fight mechanism, and it tells you to get out of the way. But if you're a law enforcement officer and you have to face the horror that may be approaching you, you get overdosed with cortisol, and that's what creates PTSD. And we found that the law enforcement officers would not go to their departments for help, which is unfortunately a typical problem. And so we actually set up a treatment program for police officers outside the department as part of this program. And so other things started to happen. Our shootings almost stopped. And while race certainly can play a role in police officer shooting, I don't think we talk nearly enough about PTSD playing a major role in police shootings. And so we went from 2 shootings a month in Miami-Dade County before our project to maybe 5 or 6 in 8 years. And so it has had an enormous impact, and it also made our law enforcement officers so much more empathetic to this population that we're trying to serve. I mean, if you look at the rest of the data, it makes a lot of sense. 92% of all the women in jails and prisons in the United States with serious mental illnesses were sexually abused as children. 92%. And they have severe trauma. And a young child that is exposed to trauma, their brain is damaged even more than an adult brain. And so they're behind the 8 ball before they even start. It's usually familiar, so it goes on for long periods of time. They become a problem in the school. The school doesn't wrap their arms around them and ask, why are you, something going on? They just punish the behavior, and they end up making the problem worse. And the young woman ends up growing up into my system because their brain's been damaged because they were a victim at 6, 7, 8 years old. It's horrifying. And so when I said if I were to do this again, I'd have a 3-part system. The other part I would have brought in would have been pediatricians and the school board, because we need to start screening for trauma at a very young age. 75% of men who are in jail and prisons with serious mental illnesses also have very serious trauma issues. Some of it may be sexual abuse, but it's often domestic violence, or it's living in a war zone and seeing things that a child should just never have to see. And it permanently alters the brain activity. This is physiological. This has nothing to do with being stronger or tougher. You need treatment for it. Just like the officer who's getting exposed or the soldier who's getting PTSD, they need treatment. And so that was the first part of our system, the pre-arrest. We also did a lot of studying, and we have this great institution in Florida, at the University of South Florida, called the Florida Mental Health Institute. And they have the ability to blend data sets. And they can tell a community who the highest utilizers of criminal justice and mental health services are. And what we found is you don't have to fix the whole system. What you need to do is to get smarter and start to target your limited resources on the people that are killing the whole system. So we sent them the names of 3,300 people that had come through our system over 5 years that we knew had a very serious mental illness. And we said, can you please narrow it down and tell us who these high utilizers are so we can do a better job focusing on this population? Well, to my amazement, they narrowed it down to 97 people, primarily men, primarily diagnosed with a schizophrenic, schizoaffective disorder, primarily homeless, primarily co-occurring, meaning they have both a mental health disorder and a substance use disorder, who over 5 years, these 97 people were arrested 2,200 times. They spent 27,000 days in the Dade County Jail. They spent 13,000 days at a state-funded psychiatric facility. They cost taxpayers in my community and state $14.7 million, and we got absolutely nothing for it. We joke, but the reality is we would have been better off sending them to Harvard. They would have had an education, they would have had a roof over their head, they would have had better relationships, they would not have been re-traumatized, and they probably would have had a better shot at staying out of the criminal justice system than, unfortunately, what we did. So we decided we needed to set up these post-arrest diversion systems. So what we did is we changed our screening tool at our jail, and everybody that comes in, and we changed the arrest affidavit, where the police actually can check a box if they think the person may have a mental health disorder, which it gives us an extra identification. And if they meet our criteria for involuntary commitment under Florida's law, and it's a misdemeanor, we divert them out of the jail within 3 days, and we send them to one of our crisis stabilization units. And because they're on a criminal hold, the 72 hours of the civil law doesn't apply, which enables us to actually get them the level of treatment that they need. And we send them for about 2 weeks. And while they're at the facility, we send a member of our team over and we offer them the opportunity to come in the program. And if they come in, they don't get rebooked. And they go directly to the courtroom. And when they get to the court, we have one of our 8 peers. Peers are people with serious mental illnesses that are in recovery, working for the court. 4 of them actually graduated from our program. They're waiting for them in court with food, with clothes, with their medication. We have their benefits process begun. We have housing for them. The county gave us a car, and we then transport them directly from the courtroom where they're going to be living, and we start this process. And what we found is that people naively think if they just take their medication, they're going to be fine. It's much more complicated because for so many of these individuals, by the time they get arrested with a serious mental illness, they have clinical depression on top of their mental illness. They don't care if they breathe, not to mention if they take their medication. And so what happens is our peers help develop a relationship with them and incentivize them to want to get better. And then the court monitors them, helps them find what they need. We act as boundary spanners. We get them the services that they need. And guess what happened? Recidivism dropped from 72% to 20%. And so it works so well that it really turns out that if you do the right thing for the right reason, it's a public safety tool. And our state attorney was, Kathy Rundle-Fernandez, was very pleased with the outcomes we were getting. So we talked about it, and she agreed to allow us to expand it to nonviolent felony cases. And so that program has seen a reduction in recidivism to about 25% as well. That program has saved the county 33,000 jail bed days, which is 84 years of jail bed days, because people aren't coming back, because they're getting the services that they need. We also set up 2 other diversion programs. We have a program for competency restoration, where we take people who otherwise would have gone to a competency restoration facility, we keep them in a local program, and instead of focusing on restoring people, which is such a waste of money, we actually focus on reintegrating them back to the community and get them the services they need and then put them in our felony diversion program once they're stable. People don't understand the cost of not doing this right is exorbitant. Last year in the United States, the county spent $80 billion in jail costs. It's getting so hard and difficult for counties, they now have to decide, do I build a new jail or a new hospital, a new school or a new jail, a new road or a new jail, because it's such a problem and it's growing. The states last year spent $70 billion on prison costs, and they spent probably another $4 or $5 billion on restoration. And so the last more recent program we started is we got our legislature, and if Senator Brandes is here, thank you, to give authority to the county court criminal division, where you see all those misdemeanor homeless folks coming in to use something called assisted outpatient treatment. And this is a law that actually allows us to require people to take their treatment. And it's usually the homeless guy that's been on the streets forever, that keeps recycling, that lacks insight to their illness. And it is one of the most remarkable things to watch. People who have been ill for decades, who have had no life, had no insight, get their humanity back. And all of a sudden, have a life again. And so we still have about 20 to 30% of the population that we've not been able to help, usually because they're just so sick, and there's no capacity anywhere in the United States for those kind of services. So we're very fortunate. I live in an amazing county, Miami-Dade. My county actually gave us $42.1 million with $8 million from our local public hospital, Jackson Memorial. And we are now on construction right now, renovating, ironically, an old competency restoration facility. And we are building the first of its kind facility in the United States of a one-stop shop so that we can take this very acute population and build a medical home. So it'll have both primary and psychiatric services, day activities to teach self-sufficiency, culinary supportive programs so we can teach people job skills so when they leave us, they can go back into the community with employment. It'll have an eye clinic, a dental clinic, tattoo removal, because people under psychosis do silly things and it's hard to get a job with, a marijuana leaf tattooed on your face. And it'll have a courtroom, and it'll have trauma services, and it'll have a crisis unit, and it'll have housing, and for about 200 beds. And we see about 9,000 people will go through this, and it'll serve probably about 1,500 a year. And it'll take that last group that we haven't been able to help, and instead of just kicking them to the curb once we adjudicate their case, we'll gently reintegrate them back into the community. And we think once we have that building up and running, along with the other services that we've been doing for 20 years now, we'll really have a pretty good grip on the problem. And we'll decriminalize mental illness, and we'll give people the opportunity to get their lives back. And ultimately, we'll really do what the Supreme Court wanted us to do 40 years ago when they ordered deinstitutionalization.
Well, you've got a lot going on in Miami-Dade, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people asking you questions later. But I know I got a cue of sign of this, which really means it's time to go. And I'm sure that you'll be out later. Well, you have to leave right away, do you not? Right? But reach out, and I'm sure you can give some more information.
Happy to help any way we can, and we'll send materials on what we're doing. So
well, thank you, Judge. I appreciate your time as well. Thank you all.